Let me first express my gratitude for the invitation to this Congress. I'm here with pleasure. And since I'm in the same podium with Harry Ashka, let me also express my gratitude for the critical editions of the logic text. It's really a wonderful edition. Now we can really study the logic, not as a book fallen from heaven or from hell. But as it should, in a system laden. And this brings me to my paper, because what I'm presenting here is an occasional paper in the literal sense that it is motivated by purely historical circumstance. As it happens, Friedrich Beisser's interpretation of Hegel recently came to my attention just as I was completing a study of Hegel's greater logic. And this interpretation posed a challenge to my own understanding of Hegel in ways that I could not ignore. For those who don't know, Friedrich Beisser is now writing the more popular books on Hegel in North America. This presentation is my attempt at dealing with this challenge. In some respect, Beisser is close in spirit and also in the letter to good old John MacTaggart, that's my attempt at the Scottish bloke, whose metaphysical reading of Hegel's logic was once canonical in the English-speaking world, and in some quarters still is. But the difference between the two in both historical knowledge and conceptual sophistication are also enormous. In this, Beisser's, so to speak, consonance at a distance with MacTaggart is what makes his reading of Hegel especially challenging. Let me expatiate. Beisser advances a revisionist reading of the so-called early German Romanticism, the Frühromantik, a period which includes aspects of Schiller's work, the very early Hegel, the first Schelling, Hölderlin, Novalis, and Friedrich Schlegel. His thesis, which ought to be read in conjunction with Manfred Franz's recent but already classic studies on the Frühromantik, is threefold. First, there is the claim that the more literary members of the just mentioned group, notably Schiller, Hölderlin, Novalis, and Friedrich Schlegel, were not at all philosophical dilettantes, as many commentators who approached them from the restricted viewpoint of their literary output would have us believe. On the contrary, these early romantics practiced a type of sophisticated skepticism, a poetic irony, a stylistic disavowal, or whatever they might otherwise reflectively hold, which was motivated by their belief that conceptual reflection is ultimately an inadequate medium for expressing the full truth of reality. Second, he claims that this early romanticism, far from being a retreat into subjectivism, was on the contrary a realistic search for objectivity. It was a rejection of Descartes, and also of Kant and Fichte, to the extent that the formalism of these last two still suffered from elements of Cartesian subjectivism. This was the case for everyone in the Romantic group, philosophers and poets alike. As the presiding genius of this new type of naturalism was none other than the figure of Spinoza, early Romanticism was, in essence, a Spinozistic movement. Jacobi, if I may gloss, had warned from very early on that the new transcendental realism, even in its original Kantian form, was a form of Spinozism. The early Romantics took this warning instead as an invitation for a new philosophical program. Finally, the most distinctive element of this movement was its mysticism. All the early Romantics came from a Protestant, deeply religious, and in some cases even pietistic background. According to Beisser, however, this mysticism was in fact an offshoot of ancient Platonic and Neoplatonic roots. It was a case of Platonic contemplation. Beisser's tendencies to interpret the whole early Romantic, including Hegel, as a revival of Platonism. There was nothing irrational about this mysticism, despite Novalis' characterization of this idealism as magical. On the contrary, it was the factor that explained their otherwise paradoxical juxtaposition of an unsystematic spirit and Spinozistic naturalism. The early Romantics aimed at a naturalistic, that is, rational, conceptual apprehension of reality of the kind that Spinoza prescribed. But for them, this reality was one to which original access was possible only through feelings or other non-reflective means of non-reflective means that transcend rational structures. They were thus using Spinoza's system in order to bring critical limits to what might have otherwise degenerated into an untrammeled mysticism. But all the same, by introducing Spinoza's static system into their mystical matrix, they were adding to the system an extra dynamic dimension that it otherwise missed. The early Romantics were ontological realists. They sought the intelligible structure of a transcendent, that is, non-subjective reality, which as such ultimately remains ineffable. I have repeatedly glossed Beiser's claim while reporting them, but except from not adverting at all to the differences that separated these early Romantics, I believe that I have represented such views accurately. I harbor more than one reservation about them. I shall return to the issue of romantic mysticism at the end. Right now, I might point out that I find it difficult to accept that Spinoza's system was per se static, I quote. Jacobi, the first to possess a truly historical grasp of Spinoza, rightly recognized that Spinoza's res extensa, unlike Descartes' quantity, was a dynamic concept, an expanding force. Both Fichte and Schelling picked up on precisely this point. But in general, I have no difficulty accepting Beiser's global claim that the early Romantique was a Spinozistic movement. The merit of Beiser's account is his reminder that this Spinozism was a form of naturalism, and that the early Romantics found it particularly suited for satisfying their mystical inclinations. However, in order to reconcile such inclinations with Spinoza's brand of naturalism, a special system was required, an unsystematic sort of system that blended poesy and rationalism together. This is the kind of system that the early Romantics worked at, and which, if not viewed sympathetically from their own standpoint, makes them look obscure, if not downright confused. For the early Romantics, there could be no divorcing of poetry and philosophy. It might be possible, perhaps, to fit the early Hegel into this mold, although this would constitute a problem all by itself. But what about the mature Hegel, by which I mean the Hegel of the greater logic? How does one fit him into it? This is the challenge that the full Romantique poses. Beiser is right in not trusting Hegel's own triumphalist estimate of his relation to his immediate past, as if his system were the logical culmination of the idealism that preceded it. Too many commentators have tacitly accepted this Hegel's estimate, and this acceptance has adversely colored their interpretation of the period. Beiser is right again. Taken one by one, every major thesis of Hegel, notably the identity of identity and non-identity, is already to be found in the early Romantics. But is it true, as Beiser apparently believes, that Hegel's idealism, despite the early break with Schelling, still falls within the compass of the absolute idealism of which the early Romantics were the true founders? According to Beiser, for the early Romantics, the absolute idea was a regulative construct that stands for the imperfect intelligibility which we ought to expect in reality, by which in fact, for the perfect intelligibility which we ought to expect in reality, by which in fact we can either apprehend only mystically or aesthetically, or merely approximate conceptually. I choose not to dispute the claim, Although I must say, the claim seems to have the unfortunate consequence of making the early romantics subjectivist, malgré leur. My question is whether Hegel's spirit can then be taken to be just a variation on this absolute idea, as thus understood by the early romantics. Weiser likes to portray Hegel, their alter of the Tübinger Stift, as a plodder who made his way on crutches, thus Weiser, over the brilliant insights of his predecessors. So be it that Hegel was a plodder, might well be true. So was Thomas Aquinas, the ox for Naples. But the problem is that Hegel indisputably claimed that it is possible to have an exhaustible knowledge of the idea. And this is a claim which is incompatible with the poetic non-knowledge that the early romantics apparently practiced, incompatible with the skepticism about conceptual foundations which, according to Weiser, they had to practice in order to stave off the tension that otherwise arose in their unsystematic system between the beliefs, on the one hand, that the absolute is supra-rational and therefore impersonal, and on the other hand, that it is the source of the rationality upon which our very personal human institutions are dependent. There is no such skepticism in Hegel. The upshot is that Hegel, with outstanding metaphysical dogmatic abandon, would have transformed the romantic absolute idea, allegedly only a regulative construct, into a cosmic mind, one which is impersonal and yet rational, and of which we can know the internal logic, at least in outline. This is precisely the position that MacTaggart attributes to Hegel. But any such cosmic mind is metaphysical nonsense. I'm saying, in other words, that on Weiser's strategy of making the mature Hegel continuous with the full romantique, Hegel turns out to be not just a plodder, but a singularly obtuse one at that. This is a position that I'm not ready to accept. I'm suggesting, in other words, that Hegel's break with his own early romanticism was radical, and that the logic can be read precisely as an anti-romantic manifesto. This is the suggestion that I now want to develop. There is first the ontological realism that Weiser attributes to the early romantics. Exact what is the nature of this realism? Or alternatively, what is the nature of the alleged subjectivism which it is supposed to counteract? Surely it cannot be the psychological subjectivism of the popular philosophen. This is the subjectivism which owed its inspiration to Locke, the other figure standing opposite to Spinoza, that overshadowed the whole Enlightenment. There is historically a line of influence running from popular philosophy to pure romantique. But if that was the subjectivism that the early romantics were reacting against, then we must say that their philosophical discourse had fallen in sophistication way below the level at which the Jacobi, of whom they also thought themselves to be the disciples, had raised the issue of realism at the time of the pantheism strikes, the Spinoza strike. Jacobi's brief against Spinoza had been metaphysical in nature. His objection to the Greek philosopher was that, since his system was an absolute monism based on the principle of one substance, it reduced to mere appearance the reality of the modes which, according to the same system, emerge out of it. It necessarily relativized their determinateness and therefore also preempted the possibility of irreducible individuality, hence of agency, hence of moral responsibility. Whatever limits are introduced in the experience to separate and order such modes can only be the reflective products of a finite mind, itself a mode whose reality within the system remains just as unexplained as the reality of any other mode, and hence which remains